Welcome, everyone. Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And today we're going to have some fun with a lot of topics, or many topics that are not typically covered, but should be and are really important to biology and improving your health. We're going to do that with Dr. Alexis Cowan. She is a Ph.D. molecular biologist. And if I was to get a Ph.D., if I shared with her, it would be in molecular biology. That's absolutely my favorite topic, and one I'm actually writing a lot of about recently and writing papers in it. So the it has so much potential for understanding how we can optimize our biology. I don't know if there's any other better discipline to do that. And in fact, my favorite journal is Nature's Review in in molecular bio. I think it's what's the Nature paper? The Nature Reviews
There's
in
so
cell
many
biology.
these days. I don't. I can't even
Okay,
remember
anyway,
them all.
they only come out like every quarter, but they have this long 40-page report that's just probably the best paper ever written in that topic, the one that they review. But anyway, we're going to and you're at Princeton, and
Yep.
you actually live near Princeton, I believe, right?
Yep, I'm still in
Yeah,
the
so
area.
yeah, so you're up in, is that New Jersey?
Yep,
Okay.
Central Jersey.
Central Jersey. So yeah, unfortunately, that's a bit, you're not getting as much sunshine as you could up at that far north, but it's okay. It'll change
Yeah, I mean the
because we're.
sun isn't too much the problem. It's like the geoengineering that's kicking our butts, to be honest.
Oh, okay. We could talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, we should.
Yeah. So maybe get your whole perspective, because it seems like one of your passions is light and circadian rhythm, and that's a frequently uh, ignored topic in most discussions about health. There are some people who integrate into what they're doing, and one of my favorites is oh gosh, he's out of
Sachin Panda?
Sachin Panda out of the Salk Institute.
Yep.
Yes, yeah, great guy. I've interviewed him twice, and probably should do it again. But he seems to be the preeminent leader in this field, at least documenting the research. And I love, he's so calm and gentle and kind. He's done some really pioneering studies, though. It document not just circadian rhythm, but the intermittent fasting and that window that you
Yep.
want to restrict your eating to optimize your health.
Yep.
So maybe we can touch on that too. So well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey, and keep it short and sweet so that people know your background, and because you've got a lot of stuff to talk about.
Yeah, I do. I'll try to keep it short and sweet. So, I mean, I did my PhD at Princeton, like you mentioned, in the molecular biology department, though the lab that I studied in and did research in was metabolism focused, one of the top metabolism research labs in the world, the Rabinowitz lab. And so I really cut my teeth as one could say a food guru. That's how Dr. Jack Kruse would describe it, understanding how different dietary inputs shaped metabolism in different organs, but also at the whole body level. So that included fasting versus feeding, high carbohydrate diet versus ketogenic diet. And that was kind of, my bread and butter was assessing metabolism using isotope tracers to be able to look into different tissues and see how different metabolites were being used and where they were ending up as well. Before that, when I did my undergrad, I got a degree in biochemistry and minored in math. I was actually initially in culinary school and pivoted after a very, let's say, pivotal experience. I don't know if you want to get into it specifically, but anyway, it was a psychedelic experience. And
Oh,
I had this just complete shift in the way that I was viewing life and myself and my interests. And so I ended up pivoting into science after that. But yeah, then I did a little bit of work in industry.
was that DMT or psilocybin?
It was LSD.
Oh, LSD. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. And I was 18, 19 at the time, and really just completely piqued my interest with regards to, okay, what can I do to actually understand the nature of reality? Because this just blew everything that I thought I knew out of the water.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
And so
I
that
think
kind of led
isn't LSD a serotonin antagonist?
it works on, it's a classic psychedelic, so it works on the serotonin H2A receptor primarily.
Yeah.
Psilocybin also does as
Yeah.
well. DMT, I think, also does as well. All the classical psychedelics tend to work on that receptor. I
Mhm.
don't know if it actually modulates levels versus actually just
And
tickling certain receptors, for example.
yeah, but I think ultimately it inhibits serotonin.
Well, it's an activator of the receptor, the H2A receptor,
Yeah.
basically tickles it and stimulates it. But, I think we have a ton to learn on that front.
Yeah,
And I
yeah, for
think,
sure. Well, we don't want to explore that anyway. So, but
yeah,
it was a
exactly.
catalyst. It was a catalyst for your transformation and shifting into a different area of focus.
Yeah, though I would say I was kind of already teed up for that somewhat because at the end of high school, I lost 100 pounds and that kind of began my healing journey. I had a whole bunch of health issues as a kid, including obviously childhood obesity, but in addition to that, a lot of respiratory infections, skin infections, just really like, squandered childhood essentially from a health standpoint, and chronic recurring strep throat in first grade. Docs wanted to pull out my tonsils. We didn't have insurance at the time, so we didn't end up doing it, which I'm kind of, glad for, because I think, now we know the tonsils are a really important part of the gut associated lymphoid tissue and play an important role in the immune system. They're not just an expendable organ like they're often treated. But anyways, so yeah, I had this health journey kind of going on in the background that really kind of teed up me being interested in understanding science as it relates to the health of the body and what you can actually do about it. And so that's kind of, I guess, the abbreviated version of how I ended up
Well, thank you.
where I'm at.
I have a curiosity after that story is wondering what you believe is the catalyst for your astounding ability to recall facts and synthesize them into coherent information, almost a photobiographical memory. So, as in light of the fact that you had a compromised, less than ideal upbringing in nutrition, so how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I don't know. There's definitely environmental factors that can shape that, but what I can tell you is that regardless of what was going on in my life, I was always an optimistic person. I was always a very curious person. I also grew up in very much emerged in nature. Basically, grew up in the middle of the woods. So most of New Jersey is actually pretty rural, even though people think it's just an extension of New York. So I grew up in Northwest Jersey, which is like the cows and corn part. Central Jersey is also pretty similar to that. It's, quite rural, lots of farms, regenerative farms included. So I grew up basically outside barefoot all the time in the woods, like in streams, like fishing and just like doing the nature thing. And so that was a huge benefit, I would say, to my health. The what really got me though, I think, was I'm pretty sure we had pretty extensive black mold in the house. I remember standing water smells. We had carpet in the bathroom. And actually, my health started to decline rapidly when I got pulled out of school in first grade after this chronic recurring strep throat. My mom pulled me out because I kept getting sick. And then I was basically in the house even more. And it was during that year that my weight exploded. Before that, in first grade,
Oh,
I looked like all the
interesting.
other kids. Like I was lean, I was healthy, then started getting the strep throat. When I got homeschooled, my weight ballooned. And when I went back to school in third grade, I weighed double my classmates and it continued spiraling up through there. So I think there was something in
Wow.
the house because even
Yeah.
our animals were also fat and sick. And everybody who was there was basically obese and unwell, except for my grandma, who actually went to work every day for like 8 hours a day at the courthouse, but she was out of the house. So I think there was something about the house that was just really poisoning our mitochondria.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is a dual passion of both of us. We were fond of,
Yes.
very fond. We're mitochondrias, I think you might classify us as.
Amen. I have
So,
my sweater on that says "Make mitochondria great again."
We've talked together before this interview, and we shared our interest in this, and really, I think both believe that if you can get those mitochondria healthy, pretty much most disease reverses. So
Absolutely.
that's the focus, and there's so many ways that we can do that. That's why I really want to engage in this conversation. But I suspect that experience you just described in your childhood is also responsible for the skepticism you have of conventional medicine, because most
Yeah.
physicians don't know how to treat this, and you encounter, like many people do with similar diseases, and that just going down the wrong trail, and you just wrong information, and it didn't help you. You had to figure it out yourself, which is
Yes.
essentially you have to become your own doctor, and we're both passionate about teaching people information so that they can engage in that critical thinking skills and navigate the way themselves because it's dangerous to rely on conventional medicine for most things, not all things, but for most things. You can
Totally.
really, yeah. So that seems to be the catalyst for your drive to, is that right? Or maybe you can span it.
Yeah, I would say
Yeah.
that's correct. And so I mean, despite uh the lack of pleasantries that I experienced growing up in that context, it was, I wouldn't change anything because it definitely, led me to exploring the things that I've explored and doing the work that I've been doing. And it was all, required in order for me to have the perspective that would even be interested in pursuing a counterculture, medical countercultural perspective, let's say, and helping to heal chronic disease from an actual root cause perspective, from this mitochondrial perspective. And I would totally agree that Western medicine is great in the acute context for acute traumas and injuries and keeping people alive in a pinch. But when it comes to creating long-term health and improving health span, they don't know what they're doing because they're trying to apply this reductionist mechanistic model to a system that's far more complex than we could ever imagine.
So now I think that's a good framework to start engaging in a conversation about what you have found with your amazing horse brain power and optimized mitochondria at this time to that and what the material you have digested and having a really pursued a postdoctorate degree or a doctoral degree in one of the best disciplines, I believe, that is designed to help people understand what to use of reality and integrate that into your lifestyle to optimize health. So maybe you could highlight the top few, and then we can dive into those. But from your perspective, what would you say if someone is engaged, is interested, intrigued, or has been interested in engaged in this area for many decades, and what would you recommend that they focus on from your perspective?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you would have asked me 2.5 years ago, let's say, I would have spouted something pretty centralized, like diet and exercise, most important aspects to optimize your health. And hey, I mean, I lost 100 pounds through diet and exercise alone. So, like, there is merit there. But after I lost that weight, I was left with an eating disorder and irritable bowel syndrome, ulcerative colitis, something along those lines that was brutal. And so that kind of is what initiated my interest in looking into things a bit deeper. But, even up through grad school, I was still very much brought up in that paradigm where we were kind of myopically focused on, let's say metabolism through the lens of nutrition and movement. But what I discovered after going back for a postdoc at University of Pennsylvania in the Tice lab, who's actually now at Stanford, but it was during that time I fell down the rabbit hole on light and circadian biology. So before that, I was aware of Sachin Panda's work. I had heard him on multiple podcasts, thought it was cool, but for whatever reason, the way he described it, I just didn't see it as like, this is the most important thing I need to think about and focused my life on. It wasn't until I actually listened to Rick Rubin's podcast with Huberman and Cruz that came out in April of 2023, where I was like, oh crap, like I really missed some huge areas here within biology that like can't be overlooked because of their fundamental aspect. And that really relates to light biology and circadian biology, because both of those are really setting the foundation for your mitochondria, your powerhouses of the cell that, they're not only powerhouses, they also produce a bunch of metabolic water, which is very special. And we can talk about that in a little bit. They also produce a lot of light. So if you get an infrared camera, you can look at somebody on it because, heat essentially is another word for infrared light. So you can see yourself on an infrared camera. We're emitting all of this light, but it's also been known for, over 70 years now that the body and the mitochondria also produce UV biophotons as well. And it's actually a phenomenon that's shared across biology. So the first studies that were done in this area were by Alexander Gurwitch in the 1920s, and his onion root experiments, he saw what he termed as mitogenetic radiation, which was basically when he cut an onion root in half and put a piece of glass, plain glass, in between them, nothing happened. But when he put a piece of quartz glass in between the slices, there was some sort of a factor that was able to stimulate the growth of new sprouts from the onion root. And because the main difference between glass and quartz glass is the feature of UV photons being able to pass through it, he deemed these UV photons mitogenetic radiation, and this was the first documented case of UV light being produced from biology. And that
now is UV the only frequency that passes through? Does infrared pass through quartz?
Yeah, quartz lets everything through.
That's what I thought. So how did he isolate that or come to that conclusion when it could be at other frequencies? Why did he say it was UV and not infrared?
So the glass that they were using back then wasn't coated or anything, so it also lets infrared light through. So the main frequency that wasn't getting through that glass was UV. Like today, our
Wait.
modern window glass is often coated to prevent a lot of near infrared and infrared in general from coming through because
Yeah.
it's energy efficient. So
Okay.
at the time, it was like bewildering and let's say groundbreaking because nobody else, and it was also contentious for decades after that. People tried to repeat his experiments. There were issues with their methodologies and recreating his exposures, but then that work ended up being picked up by quite a few different people, actually. So with regards to light biology, one of the next people who picked it up was Albert St. Georgi, who was the 1939 Nobel Prize winner. He actually got the Nobel Prize for vitamin C research in metabolism. But he was also the one who set the stage for Robert O. Becker, and I have the Body Electric next to me. So Robert O. Becker was...
Old book. That was last century.
Oh yeah. But endless wisdom, and we'll get into, because basically what happened was Becker ended up getting canceled and his work was lost to history, but we'll get to that in a moment. But what ended
you
up
actually,
happening...
just if I can interject here, you did a brilliant podcast with his co-author. I forget his name, but
Andrew
it was
Marino.
and he's in his 80s now, I believe, but he actually worked with him.
Yeah.
It was real. Congratulations on doing that. It was a really fascinating story you revealed.
I was so honored to be able to speak with him, and he's still kicking. Like, he's still writing books and doing a thing, which is amazing. But anyway, so back to Becker. So he was in med school. Had to have been in the 40s, early 40s, I guess. And St. Georgi came and gave a talk at his commencement and said something that was kind of puzzling to Becker. He said that it seemed like all proteins encoded by the human genome, or in the genomes in general of biology, seemed to have an electronic structure, and that he believed that all proteins that are translated from the DNA are actually semiconductors. And then Becker ended up starting a lab, which was kind of curious. As an MD, he wasn't an MD Ph.D., but as a pure MD, he started a DoD and ARPA-funded research lab to actually study this hypothesis, and ended up proving that it was true. And like you alluded to, Dr. Andrew Marino was a student in his lab from, I believe, the mid-50s up through the mid-60s. And they ended up doing research on non-native EMFs, because at the time there were, radio frequencies starting to be used, whether it's like actually AM/FM radio or these big antennas that the military was starting to build. One was called the Sanguine antenna. And so they ended up doing research also on limb regeneration. And basically Becker's work showed that very, very small voltages were able to trigger wound healing and regeneration in tissues like bone, or in animals like salamanders. If you cut a limb off, that there's actually a frequency or a voltage that was created to stimulate that limb to regrow. And so he had this really strong sense of electrobiology being extremely important in regeneration and healing. And this was a very strong interest to the military, because we had a lot of vets coming back injured, maybe missing limbs. If there was an ability to actually do something about that, leveraging electrobiology, that would be extremely powerful. But what ended up happening is that the implications of his work, as he began to study now the effects of external EMF frequencies, electromagnetic frequencies in the environment on these processes, he began to find that essentially there were harms, that in rodents you could get the formation of tumors, that you can stop wound healing and bone regeneration by simply having these so-called non-native EMFs in the environment. And he was submitting manuscripts to the archives of the military on this point, and he was expecting them to respond in kind and, start to actually, I guess, take a closer look at the tech they were building to make it more biology friendly. But what he ended up finding is that when he went and looked into the archives, that those papers he had submitted were missing. And what he ended up doing in 1967 is blowing the whistle on the late night talk show called 60 Minutes, which was very popular up until maybe a decade ago or so. And he blew the whole story wide open about these effects of these different non-native EMFs on wound healing and on the models that he was studying. And within 2 days of that interview, all of his funding was pulled and he lost his livelihood, and he ended up actually being a very bitter man after that. And Marino actually ended up going and starting his own lab in Louisiana, studying non-native EMFs through a slightly different lens that allowed him to still get funding. But essentially, starting in 1967, this information about the harms of non-native EMFs was lost to history and kind of buried. And it's to the point now where it's like maybe starting to get some traction, but still largely seen as like woo-woo or like pseudoscience to even talk about it, when it was actually very hard science that's been buried.
So how does this information help people apply what you've learned to optimize their biology? How place this in context now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I guess I should backtrack and say that non-native EMFs are also a form of light. I mentioned radio frequencies earlier, so those are a long wavelength form of light that's up past infrared, that's non-visible, so we can't see it. The visible part of the spectrum is like the Roy G. Biv that people learn in school, red through violet. UV and infrared are also non-visible. And then the radio frequencies are even, farther out, more non-visible. We can't see it with our eyes, but our cells can sense it. And so the reason that's important, especially in the modern day context, is that we are being bathed in these things 24/7, 365 in the form of whether it's 5G, 4G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, use of cellular devices, use of wireless devices in general. It's like ubiquitous now. And this was actually one of the major issues when Becker blew the whistle in the 60s on this issue. People couldn't really relate to it because, they were maybe using the radio, but nobody had a cell phone. Nobody had Wi-Fi. Like, that wasn't even a thing. And so at that time, I don't think it really resonated with people as a major problem.
Well, the damage wasn't as severe. It exploded after the iPhone in 2007.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
That's when it exploded, yeah.
Yeah, so with regards to modern day context, it's like extremely relevant. And what I usually instruct people on is to understand some principle in physics called the inverse square law, which basically states the closer you are to an emitter of non-native EMFs, the stronger the signal is, and the more issues it can cause. Because our mitochondria are detecting these frequencies, and there's research to show that when you're exposed to these things, it drops the mitochondrial membrane potential, which is basically a sign of how well the mitochondria can work. And this actually relates really strongly to like reactive oxygen species or reactive nitrogen species biology, which we can get into maybe in a little bit. But this,
I have a curiosity question. Did you read my book that I wrote, EMF'd?
No, I didn't.
I'll send you a copy. I believe it is the best book written on EMF'd.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd love to check it out.
Lots of references. Unfortunately, it came out right before the COVID pandemic hit, so it didn't get a lot of PR, unfortunately. Yeah. But I'm quite familiar with the topic, and I'm wondering from your perspective. We can go deep on this, but I want to cover a broader spectrum of topics, not just focus on EMF. And here's part of the reason: what I've learned through that experience in writing. Again, I actually rewrote the book a few times because it took me 2 or 3 years to write. It was almost the longest time it ever took me to write a book. I can write a book much quicker, but because of other tools that we have. But the point I wanted to make is the reason this is such a challenging topic for people to integrate and comprehend is, and I'm actually going to write a book on this topic. It's the title of the book I'm going to write, maybe next year, maybe later this year, is The Convenience of Tyranny. The tyranny of convenience. So the capture, it just captures them. They don't want to exchange the massive convenience that this technology provides us. And they're willing to make that shift. And they, for a theoretical, in many cases, it's not the case, of course, it's obvious. But most people, this is a theoretical perspective, and they're not willing to make that sacrifice. So that's why I've even though I agree wholeheartedly with that, I wrote a whole book, and I think, as I said, it's one of the best books published on the topic, and I will send you a copy, that it's difficult to communicate to people because there's so much resistance and a brick wall against first of all, believing it, then secondly, more importantly, integrating the recommendations, which are not easy to do. It is a giant PIA, and you know what that stands for, to integrate this technology. As I'm looking at you now, I have no Wi-Fi in my house, but it is a giant pain when you have to resort to Ethernet, which is the only way we connected to the internet prior to 2000 in the 20th century. That's the only way. The wireless explosion happened after 2000. People don't remember that, but it's a quarter century ago now, so it's a while away. But they think that wireless is normal. So what is your view after of experience, not view, but your experience in seeking to help people understand this and coming up against this inability or unwillingness to exchange convenience for health?
Yeah, so I would say even just starting with small things is better than doing nothing at all. For example, not putting your cell phone up to your ear, using speakerphone. Just don't do it. There's so much study coming out on this issue with like tumors being formed in the brain from the radio frequencies coming from the phone, whether it's a thermal caused by thermal heat or, other effects like such as on the mitochondria. But even back in 2011, there was a paper published that showed that putting the cell phone up to your ear increases glucose metabolism in the brain, which is probably in response to a stressor response. Like that research was never really continued on. And interestingly enough, the woman who published that paper at NYU or Columbia, she's the granddaughter of Trotsky, which is interesting. But anyways, so not doing that, not putting your phone to your ear, not leaving your phone on your person. So like just keeping it out of your pocket, putting it on a table, putting it on just somewhere that's away from your body when you're going to be storing it. Wi-Fi wise, a lot of people aren't going to give up Wi-Fi, but at least putting it on a timer so that it turns off while you're sleeping is a great way to mitigate your effects. Laptop, not using your laptop on your lap, put it on a desk, put it on a table so that you're not having it on your person. Any distance you can put between yourself and the source of the EMFs is going to help you. And so
putting your laptop in airplane mode.
Yeah.
So no Bluetooth, no Wi-Fi. So then the lap becomes less of an issue because you have other radiation coming from the battery, but that's not the traditional non-ionizing radiation. So, but what I was curious about, and I want to talk about the mechanism because we'll pivot to that next. Because I really haven't had the opportunity, other than talking to Dr. Paul, who seems to have the most coherent explanation at a molecular biological level as to how EMFs cause damage biologically. So, but what has been your experience in helping people integrate this into their life? Because you're a coach of some sorts, right? You teach classes personally and then collectively. And I'm wondering, what's your level of the resistance when you bring this topic up that you experience? Are people actually acting on the recommendations you're making?
So what I'll say, pretty surprisingly, is I don't know if it's because of my degrees or the way that I speak or whatever it is, but I don't get much pushback on any of the stuff that I talk about. I think people just tend to be pretty receptive, especially because I fell down this rabbit hole post-COVID where a lot of people's minds were open to major systemic issues that we're facing with health, and that it's actually not the canonical approaches that actually might help us, that maybe it's some of these quote-unquote alternative approaches actually have some merit. It could be the timing, it could be a number of things, but people seem to be receptive. People, report feeling better when they start integrating these things. So I will say, of course, oftentimes people are integrating a lot of different modalities at once. They're starting to get up for sunrise. They're blocking blue light at night. They're getting some midday sun. They're grounding. They're maybe mitigating some of their EMF exposure. So oftentimes there's a synergy of benefits, of course, but I think it's, you can make a really strong case that with regards to like mechanisms, the way that I really see it is that mitochondria are both antennas for and emitters of electromagnetic frequencies. So we talked about the frequencies produced in mitochondria, infrared and UV, but this idea that they're also detecting the electromagnetic environment and adjusting their behavior or their function accordingly is another area that I'm compelled to believe is important. And it's probably going to be something that we're going to study quite a bit in the lab in the future, which I'm in the process of building out a light lab over the next couple years. So there's lots of issues and questions that we need to answer that haven't been answered yet because light has been just very underfunded and understudied within biology, and how light can orchestrate metabolism, for example. And how
you just shifted. You were talking about the non-ionized radiation, which is not light. That's different.
It is light.
Oh, you're classifying both as light then?
Yep.
So like solar radiation is light. That's your definition.
No, all light. I'm talking about UV through infrared and the radio frequencies. They're all light. We just need to know how basically they're each affecting the body in different ways. I think that's
would that extend. Is that just non-ionized radiation, or would that extend to ionizing?
Ionizing as well.
Okay, that's what I thought. Just make sure we have the same definition, because and normally, at least in layman's terms, light is typically defined as the visible frequencies.
Yeah. So when we're talking about light or electromagnetic frequencies, when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about both visible and non-visible.
Okay, I just want that, because that's not typical.
Yep.
This is my experience, so I just wanted to get the definition straight. Yep. So I really appreciate you sharing that, because my experience is all pre-COVID, and I didn't realize that could be a massive, because it's kind of the incredible resistance to integration of these concepts just caused me to back off on it. But I didn't realize that a shift had occurred. So thank you for sharing. That was really important.
Yeah.
And before we go, you have some very intriguing concepts on the mechanism, which I've never heard of before, as far as I'm aware. And I haven't studied this since I've finished doing the research for my book. So there may be others studying, but I don't recall anyone doing work in this area. So but Paul's mechanism, are you familiar with his theory with the calcium
Yes.
voltage gated calcium channels? So in the causing intracellular calcium increases, which catalyzes the increase of superoxide and nitric oxide and forms peroxide nitrate. I thought it was really intriguing. Do you think that plays a role, or it probably does play a role, but I guess how significant is that role, especially in context of this other theory that you're exploring, which is like the mitochondria are antennas and emitters of this type of radiation?
Yeah, so I think it plays a role, and I think it's a twofold issue. So, like we mentioned earlier, when you're exposed to these frequencies, we have studies done in labs, not in the human body, but in cells at least, that in animals as well, that we can see that the mitochondrial membrane potential drops. And I guess before I can describe my other contribution, I guess, to this mechanism, I just need to describe a little bit about how mitochondria work. So there's something called the electron transport chain within mitochondria. It is the chain that allows energy and water to be produced, so ATP and metabolic water. And so there's these different protein complexes that facilitate this flow of electrons. These protein complexes, in addition to allowing electrons to move down this chain, they also pump protons into the intermembrane space, because there's two membranes in a mitochondria. So we have the inner matrix is inside the inner membrane. The intermembrane space is between the two membranes. And so these protons get pumped, or these hydrogen atoms get pumped in between into the intermembrane space. And what effectively that's doing is creating a battery, because now we're getting the separation of positive charge protons from negative charge electrons. And then that proton gradient can be dissipated through the last complex of the electron transport chain called ATP synthase. And as the protons re-enter the matrix, it causes this ATP synthase rotor to spin. So it's actually a nano rotor that is actually completely efficient. There's like no friction, no heat loss to the system. So it's an incredible feat of evolutionary biology.
I think there's some controversy as to the spin rate, because some people believe it goes like several thousand cycles per second, but I tried to prove that, and when I came up with it, was closer to single digits per second.
Yeah, I don't know. What I think the textbooks say is something like 3.4 ATPs per turn or something like this.
Yeah.
But the way that I'm focusing on it, at least, is just to say that this flow of electrons, this is how we can think of electricity. So when you plug something into the wall, there's a flow of electrons that's able to create this voltage that's powering whatever you plug in. And so in the mitochondria, this flow of electrons is electricity. You can think of it in that way. And whenever we have an electrical flow or electrical field, we also create a magnetic field at 90 degrees to that flow of electrons. And so that's important because the reactive oxygen and nitrogen species, as well as molecular oxygen itself, the reason you have to breathe is because oxygen serves as the terminal electron acceptor of this electron transport chain. It takes those electrons and water is made. But basically, the point of that is to say that oxygen...
Not just any water, metabolic water.
Exactly. Metabolic, deuterium-depleted metabolic water, which we can get into in a little bit. It's a little bit more complex. But suffice to say for now that oxygen and all of these reactive oxygen and nitrogen species are actually paramagnetic, meaning they're attracted to magnetic fields. So remember, at a 90-degree angle to an electric field, the magnetic field forms. So that means that your mitochondria are producing a magnetic field. And that's allowing oxygen to go where it needs to go to serve as this electron acceptor, but it's also allowing these reactive species to be maintained or retained within the mitochondrial environment. So when you're getting a drop in the membrane potential, you're getting a drop in the flow of electrons, you're also getting a drop in the magnetic field strength, which is then allowing these reactive species to leak out into other compartments within the cell and wreak havoc. They can create lipid peroxides, which are super reactive lipids that can create issues with different cellular structures and create oxidative stress within the cell. That can have issues in the nucleus as well, because we know that the mitochondrial function also directly affects the epigenetics and the rates of mutations within the nuclear genome, based a lot on these reactive oxygen species kind of going into different areas of the cell where they don't really belong. And so that's kind of like the double-sided theory. I think the calcium efflux and influx theory is a good one that can lead to the production of these species. And that's coupled with the fact that now these species aren't able to be retained within the mitochondrial environment due to a drop in the membrane potential and a drop in the magnetic field strength.
Yeah, especially, well, the reason I was so fascinated was peroxynitrite. I did a deep dive in that, and it's not as reactive an oxidative species as hydroxyl at all, but that's just acutely. The hydroxyl radical only lasts a billionth of a second, where the peroxynitrite lasts thousands of times longer, meaning that the hydroxyl can only traverse the distance of like a protein, where that peroxynitrite can actually go out of the mitochondria, can go out of the cell into another mitochondria, because it's alive so long. So collectively, the area under the curve may cause more damage than hydroxyl.
Yeah, I can totally see that that's a feasible perspective to have on it. And I think the reason I really like this area of study in this field is because there's so much that we can do about it from a mitochondrial medicine perspective, that it's a very actionable area of research.
Well, let's pivot to one that we both share a fascination with. That's sunlight and the integration to mitochondria and helping people understand how this might occur, because the key is the mitochondria both vigorously agree on, and I vigorously agree, vehemently agree. Not
vigorous and vehement.
Vigorous. I was saying I was searching for vigorous, and I came up with vehement. So thank you for finding the right word. But we vigorously agree on it, and so I'm curious about. I don't think we could discuss this in our last conversation about photosynthesis and a term that I call photometabolism. So in other words, maybe you can give us your perspective on the value of exposing our body to sunlight, which we're both massive advocates of, and how that exposure outside, independent of UV, which is a whole other separate conversation, and that work has been done, and we don't want not to dismiss it, but it's important. But it's not the topic we're talking about now because maybe it is. I don't think UVB. Maybe it is because of the perspective you shared earlier in the context of the mitochondria, but I didn't think it was, and maybe you'll enlighten me. But how does the radiation from the solar radiation energize, charge up the mitochondria? How does it facilitate its improvement ability to generate more ATP? I happen to believe there's I think it increases electron flow through it, and it directly increases. That doesn't. It could improve the efficiency, but I think there's an additional input that causes additional ATP, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so I would say, I would make the argument that both the infrared and the ultraviolet inputs from the sun are very important. We can start with infrared. So among the infrared spectrum, which is non-visible, we have near infrared, which is the shorter wavelengths of infrared. And these are able to penetrate the body quite deeply, the most deeply out of any other frequency. And that's important to note because whenever the sun is up, whether it's, sunrise to sunset, infrared light is available, including near infrared. And even if you're sitting in the shade, green plants reflect a ton of near infrared light. So if you're outside, as God made you without clothes, but even if you have clothes on, this light can get through. And so when near infrared light interacts with mitochondria, specifically cytochrome C oxidase, which is complex 4, it stimulates the activity of this complex, which helps to boost electron flow through the electron transport chain and support the production of not only energy, but also this deuterium-depleted metabolic water that is a special type of water that helps to hydrate the tissues at the cellular level. The water that we drink is important, especially from a blood volume perspective, but the water that our cells make is really special from a tissue hydration perspective. So near infrared light does that. And like I said, if you're outside any time of day, even in the shade, you're meant to receive a ton of this near infrared light. Meanwhile, in indoor environments, all of our energy efficient, quote unquote, LED lights, fluorescent lights, device screens, they're all completely absent of near infrared light.
Just put a pin there for a moment. I just want to expand on one point you mentioned, but the reason why this occurs, and you said in the shade, in cloudy days, and that's because near infrared passes through water, which is why it penetrates deeply in the body, because it's not absorbed by water molecules. And that's why if you go on a cloudy day, you can get this because it goes through clouds like a hot knife through butter.
Yep.
You won't get UVB as much, but you'll get basically no decrease in UVB, near infrared.
Yep. So the long wavelength light, which is like, you're basically, let's say your yellow, orange, red, infrared, have no problems getting through the atmosphere at any time of day, as well as the clouds. So that's why at sunrise, the sky looks red-orange, because the long wavelength light is able to penetrate through the atmosphere at a low solar angle, and there's basically more atmosphere to travel through. So that's why in the morning, there's no UV light until UVA rise, which is somewhere around an hour, hour and a half after sunrise, depending on where you are and what season it is. And then midday, that's where solar noon is, when the UV amount is the highest, because that's the shortest distance in the atmosphere that light needs to travel through, so more can get through. But yeah, just anyway, suffice to say is that near-infrared light is available all day to stimulate your mitochondria. And if you're sitting inside behind window glass, which modern window glass, like I mentioned earlier, is usually coated now to reflect a ton of near-infrared light, because it is somewhat thermal. And so it's seen as basically a waste if you want to maintain a stable indoor temperature, not realizing that this form of light is actually an essential nutrient for the human body that we're meant to receive all day long. And now our bodies are just absolutely, completely deficient in this frequency of light in the indoor environment. And I can make the same case for UV. But what I would say for UV is that although there is, I mean, I think we need to study if there's a direct effect on mitochondria. There could be an effect on the structuring of that deuterium-depleted metabolic water that Pollock didn't look at, because he looked at bulk water. So we need to actually look and repeat those experiments with deuterium-depleted water. And I actually have a researcher at Northwestern who's a colleague and friend of mine who's going to be repeating his experiments with deuterium-depleted water. So hopefully we have results on this pretty soon. But what UV light can do is facilitate something else as it relates to melanin biology, which is a really interesting area that is developing. And Arturo Solis Herrera is kind of spearheading this research, this concept of human photosynthesis, whereby he has worked out the theoretical yield of basically comparing melanin to chlorophyll and showing that melanin actually has an enhanced capacity to split water to make free electrons than chlorophyll does. And that's how, for people who don't know, in plants, in plants, the way that green plants photosynthesize is chlorophyll is involved in this water splitting complex that allows water to be split into hydrogen and oxygen and free electrons to be liberated in that process. And that in photosynthesis, 2 electrons get liberated. But in these theoretical models that he's working out with melanin, he actually shows that 4 electrons are likely liberated in this reaction, and that we can think about melanin as the pigment that's facilitating human photosynthesis. And it actually makes a ton of sense if we think about the effects of UV light on the body. For example, when UV light, especially UVB light, is exposed to the skin and the eyes, we make this complex prohormone called POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin. And one of the cleavage products of this prohormone is alpha MSH, or melanocyte-stimulating hormone. So as the name implies, this is a really important factor in stimulating the production of new melanin, which allows you to get a tan, let's say. But in addition to that, it also works in the hypothalamus to decrease appetite and increase energy expenditure. So essentially what First Principles is telling us is that when UV light is present, we don't need to eat as much. So I think there's a really compelling argument to be made that what he's saying is the case. And this is why I've also completely shifted my view of like what melanin is doing, because most people in the mainstream will think about melanin as simply protecting the body from UV light. My argument would be that actually melanin is facilitating enhanced acquisition of the high photonic energy of UV light, and it's actually using it productively. And I think it's really interesting.
This is not just interesting, it's fascinating, and I'd like to explore it a bit. Where is the highest concentration of the melanin? Is it the epidermis, or is it in other tissues in the body? It's just primarily restricted to this.
It's actually in multiple tissues in the body, and it's actually really interesting. Melanin is found at every sense organ boundary. It's found in the nasal mucosa, oral mucosa, inner ear, deep in the brain, and in the skin. And so that's really interesting. And actually melanin, a major defect in Parkinson's disease is loss of melanin in the substantia nigra. And it's even being accepted in the mainstream as actually the loss of melanin may be causal in Parkinson's disease. And so it's an interesting paradigm they're kind of building for themselves, because on one hand, they're not going to recommend sun exposure because it's been so like stigmatized, the dangers and the harms of sun exposure, especially UV light, which is the primary light frequency that stimulates melanin production. But on the other hand, they're finding now this reliable way to determine if especially late stage Parkinson's disease, would be this loss of melanin. And what we didn't talk about, in addition to melanin potentially facilitating what's so-called human photosynthesis, it's also a major antioxidant in the body. So it helps to scavenge free radicals. It's also a major detox organ. So it's really good at scavenging heavy metals from the circulation as well. And then, of course, in the skin, that can be sloughed off. So I think there's just an immense amount of information and fascinating work that can be done with melanin that we're kind of just in our infancy. But this melanin is present, deeper in the body as well as on the surface. And so in the wintertime, actually, one of the protocols that's important for internal melanin production is getting cold. Because as it turns out, we mentioned earlier that UV light is produced from the mitochondria. So factors that stimulate mitochondrial activity will also stimulate mitochondrial light production, infrared and UV. So when you get cold, we know that you can make a ton of light internally, especially from the brown fat tissue, which is this major heat-producing fat depot. It looks brown because it's chock full of mitochondria. Actually, less than 10% of adults are walking around today with any detectable brown fat because most people are never getting exposed to cold temperatures. They're just constantly seeking comfort and sitting at 70 degrees year round and never getting that intentional cold exposure that's required to maintain brown fat, which is allowing your body to make metabolic heat, but also light, because whenever we're making infrared light, we're also making the UV light as well through the electron transport chain and through the production of reactive species. Actually, that could be of interest to you. One of the major routes of UV biophoton production is thought to be via high energy electrons that are on the free radicals that are produced in mitochondria. So it's pretty interesting.
Interesting exploring that, but I have a few other questions first. First, I wanted to make a point on the concern of the recommendations by almost all the dermatologists, of course, that I was really rigorously opposed to for the longest time until recently. I appreciated that those concerns are valid. They absolutely are, because UVB is ionizing radiation. And in pre-industrial times, essentially ancestral times, it was healthy. But now it's problematic. And I didn't understand this until recently because of the explosion in omega-6 fats that we've had. And we have 10 times the amount. These are highly perishable fats that collect on the skin and right underneath the skin, and the UVB goes right through. It goes and it oxidizes, and they call these reactive aldehydes that will increase the risk of cancer, no question. No, that's well established. But the mechanism, they don't attribute it to the linoleic acid that's in there. But that's the reason why I caution people to go out in intense sun exposure at solar noon unless they've been on a seed oil abstinence program for at least 6 months to get that out, because the risk of skin cancer is definitely there. I didn't believe it before, but now I understand it. And also, you're going to accelerate photoaging of the skin, especially in the thin areas of your face. So if you can, it's interesting too, people who go off of seed oils or vegetable oils, they tend not to sunburn. Mm-hmm. They tend not to sunburn, but you have to be off for a few months to do it. And sunburn is an example of the damage that's happening. So if you're not having that burn in your skin, it's probably not causing other longer term complications like cancer. So I modified that. But what I wanted to discuss with you, because I'm absolutely fascinated, I didn't really appreciate, I've heard you talk about it before, but I didn't really appreciate it until you started explaining it here. What do you believe is the mechanism? How are those UVB energy rays, which clearly have more energy than infrared because it's a higher wavelength that has more power there? How is that converted into electrons, or how does it feed in? How does it feed into the mitochondria? How does it produce more energy? What is the mechanism? What's your speculation? I know this is all theoretical because no one's established this. So, but I'm sure you have a thought on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the idea is, at least in the context of the melanin story, is that the UV light, because it's higher energy wave, it's able to stimulate melanin to a higher degree that it powers it up to be able to split water to create.
Well, that's what I don't get. Help me understand. I don't get that. That's a pretty significant statement. I don't understand it.
So it's purported to work in the same way that chlorophyll works to split water to make free electrons in plants.
How does that splitting occur? I mean, is it interstitial water and intercellular water?
Yes.
And What are the enzymes involved? How structurally, how does that happen? I don't understand.
So I'm not a plant biology expert, but there's something called the water splitting complex that
Okay.
involves, I think, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. I could be wrong on that. That's basically the first step in photosynthesis that liberates free electrons that can then go on to power the production of oxygen, but also carbohydrate molecules that are then stored
Okay.
within the plant.
Yeah, because the way that plants create energy is they split the water, as you said, but then they ultimately form carbohydrates, usually typically glucose or glucose polymers.
Carbs and oxygen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, some hydrogen there too.
Yep, exactly. Well, it's actually really interesting because one of the benefits of this is that you can really see that stimulating melanin to produce molecular hydrogen, molecular oxygen, and these electrons, if true, is actually a really important mechanism by which you can reduce pseudo-hypoxia or hypoxia in the body, because now you're actually generating oxygen at the tissue level and not requiring it through the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs. That's not to say you don't need to breathe at all, but that's just to say if you have hypoxia in your body, it can help to reduce that and help to improve mitochondrial function and oxygen availability. And actually, Jack talks about his friend who has cystic fibrosis, who was told he wasn't going to live past his teen years, who's now in his 40s, and
That's an anomaly.
He's doing great. He has the body of Adonis, like completely ripped, works on like a tree farm in Mississippi, completely barefoot, shirtless all the time, tan as hell, and like is able to do really well. And he attributes that to this ability to basically provide the body with oxygen in this different route than is typically believed to be the case versus like in the lung exchange. So I think it's really interesting, and it's something that I'm definitely going to study in the light lab because
so it's on your agenda for researching.
Yes, it is.
And are there others that you know of that are exploring this area?
Yeah, well, so Arturo Solis Herrera is the primary theoreticist behind the concept to begin with. I don't know if he's doing any experimental work right now. I'm guessing he is, because it seems to be his pet project, like his passion project. So keep an eye on his work as well as more things come out. I'm sure there will be.
Well, thank you, because I'm definitely going to explore this. It's a fascinating concept. I'm really intrigued with it, and I've not looked at this area before, so I'm going to do some deep dives on it. We have some tools to help us do that.
Yes.
Especially, we're talking literally less than 2 days after the most powerful AI model in the world was ever released, which is Grok 3. Oh my gosh, what it can do to help us understand these. It basically has captured almost all the knowledge in the world that's been written about and helps put it together in a way that you can play with and interact. It's like the ultimate playground to dialogue with an intelligence of that magnitude.
Totally. Very exciting.
Yeah, I look forward to exploring that concept with them. But anyway, I want to pivot back to practical things. So what is your recommendation for optimal, maybe there's a concept called minimal MED, minimal effective dose. Because we like to be efficient. All of us have too much to do, or much that we'd like to do. So what do you believe is the MED for sun exposure? And is the timing a variable that needs to be integrated into that recommendation?
Yep, absolutely. So this is where like the vitamin D story really comes into play for me. The way I really view vitamin D is as a biomarker of your sun exposure habits. And if your vitamin D levels are optimal without supplementation, that's probably a really good sign that you're getting enough UV light and midday sun, let's say, for your body. So I like to use it in that way. Of course, the centralized model now has completely removed vitamin D testing from like regular checkups. Primarily because all of the supplementation studies have shown very minimal to null benefits on chronic disease states for vitamin D supplements, not realizing that, the vitamin D biomarker is really just a proxy for how much time you're spending outside. And so now if for example, my partner went to the doctor, he had vitamin D on his checkup, he got a bill in the mail for $200 some odd because insurance wouldn't cover it. He has good insurance as well. But if you were to Own Your Labs and show up at LabCorp yourself, it's $37 to pay for it yourself. So it's like bloated prices, insurance, a whole nother topic. But that's just to say for now that will automatically account, that vitamin D level automatically accounts for the amount of melanin in your skin. Because the more melanin you have, the more sunlight you need in order to optimize that, not only vitamin D production, but there's studies showing that over a dozen other vitamin D-like molecules are made in the skin in response to UVB light. Of course, in addition to POMC, which we talked about earlier, which is related to not only producing melanin, but also reducing appetite, improving energy expenditure. Another cleavage product of POMC is beta endorphin, which is an endogenous opioid molecule that reduces pain, anxiety, depression, improves learning, memory, cognition. Both alpha MSH and beta endorphin also improve and modulate the immune system and immune function. And so there's all these benefits that come from this POMC cascade and these cleavage products that can't be captured by any supplement. Like, we can't take a pill to replace the sun. It's just not going to happen because of the myriad of effects that happens when you're exposed to not only the UVB light, but that you get the infrared at the same time. And worth noting here as well that in nature, we always receive UV with an abundance of infrared. So midday sun is less than 10% UV, over 50% red and infrared light. We also have studies showing that red and infrared light protects the skin against damage from UV light. And a lot of the studies in the literature done with UV light were done with UV light in isolation, which is completely disingenuous because we never receive UV light in isolation. And there's also research to show that pre-treating the skin with red and infrared light before UV exposure reduces the burn risk. And so, practically speaking, that would look like going out and catching sunrise full of red and infrared light. And then if you want to go out midday, now your skin is primed and prepped. Those mitochondria are going to be better able to buffer against the high energy photons coming from UV light. But in addition to that, we also have the red and infrared light supporting mitochondrial function to improve melanin production, which also requires mitochondria in order to be made. So if you want to get a tan and you're pale, start by getting sunrise light on your skin and your eyes. Gradually build up your midday sun exposure. You're not going to need as much as somebody with very dark skin because that melanin is like a sponge for light. And so when you have a ton of melanin in your skin, that light is being sequestered away, and now it's not available to make vitamin D or POMC, for example. And so the more melanin in your skin, the more total sunlight and UV light you need in order to get that vitamin D level up, that proxy marker up. And I just like to mention that because there's so much propaganda around UV light exposure and sunlight exposure that is influencing people with black and brown skin that it really shouldn't be, because it's that messaging is really intended for people who burn easily and have less melanin in their skin. And then we see products on the market like Black Girl sunscreen, and I want to rip my hair out.
Oh,
I'm just
yeah,
like,
because
no.
yeah, the darker your skin, the more sun you need. It could be
Exactly.
3, 4, 5, 600% more.
Yes.
You almost have to be, if you're deeply pigmented, you almost have to be outside all day long to get enough sun.
Yes, exactly. Assuming that you don't live somewhere that your skin evolved to be, like near the equator,
Yeah,
for example.
right,
That's where the
right.
sun is so intense. But
Yeah.
if you have darker skin and you live at a northern latitude, like in
Right.
the US, most of the US is at a pretty high latitude. And so your body is going to be thirsty for that light. And so you're going to need some extra time in order to give it what it needs.
Well, I really appreciate your solid pragmatic recommendations and reminding people that the vitamin D is a marker. It's a marker for sun exposure. That's why it's helpful. And if you're taking supplements, that may be minimally helpful, and it's certainly going to ruin the ability of that test to help you navigate your sun exposure.
Yep.
Because everything she said is accurate. If you can't, if you're taking 10,000 units of vitamin D a day, you cannot use that test to tell you how much sun exposure you got. And it does go up pretty rapidly. In our previous call, I mentioned that this summer, I got my vitamin D level up to, this is in nanograms per milliliter, of 133 with not having taken any vitamin D for 15 years.
That's amazing.
But what I wanted to share with you is the update. I just got my results back yesterday, and this is we're recording this in mid-February, which is probably the lowest amount of vitamin D you'll have if you're getting regular sun exposure. Is probably mid-February, because it's 2 months after the winter solstice, and it dropped almost to half. It was 77.
That's still really good, though.
I'm happy with it, but it just shows. I mean, it's almost dropped by 50%.
Yeah.
And I get sun pretty much every day.
Yep.
So, so you do have a sponge, a reservoir. It's your fat tissue.
Yep.
That the vitamin D stores, and you can gently release it. But if you go 6 months, it's going to be way too low, even if you start at 130.
Yep.
So, but you do need it all the time. So, thank you for that.
And worth noting, I guess, that an optimal range for people to shoot for, in my opinion, is between 60 and 80 nanograms per milliliter.
Yeah, I've been saying that for decades.
Yep.
So yeah, 100%. And that's into, even though we're absolutely aligned with that recommendation, have been recommending it for a long time, that is not what the conventional therapeutics recommend. They recommend like 30,
I know.
which is insane. I mean, that was been disproved so long ago. Anything under 40 is, I perceive, as dangerous.
Yep.
40 is the bare minimum. And the reason you want 50 at even better is because just what I explained, how much my vitamin D dropped. You have to have a buffer when you're not getting sun exposure, and not everyone is always be able to go out in the sun. So that's why 60 days is better, because you have to be above 40. And if you're at 80 and you drop to 45, you're still good.
Yep.
You're still good. So at 40, you have no buffer. You're just at the minimum that you need.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the question I had for you is the context of the dose. So and with respect to your recommendation of the very pleasant experience that most people have at sunrise or sunset. But it seems to me, because of the amount of atmosphere it has to go through, there's not a large amount of energy in the infrared. It's there, and is there an exclusion. The other wavelengths are filtered out. But is that sufficient amount to provide the protective that you alluded to in the other studies that show very clearly that near infrared radiation provides a very effective beneficial impact to preventing the damage from UV? But is it sufficient at sunrise and sunset? I would think it might be better like a little later, like 7, 8, or 9 in the morning.
Yeah, so good question. There's a couple different things to consider here. So in addition to the protection against, let's say, sunburn by leveraging near infrared light, you're definitely getting a decent dose at sunrise, sunset. If you go out 7, 8, 9, you're already getting some UV rays around then. UVA rise typically is it really varies depending on your latitude and time of year. But right now it's like an hour and a half after sunrise for me here in New Jersey, but it's going to vary. But anyway, the reason I want to bring this up is because there's also a circadian aspect to burning. And we know that if you're, for example, eating super late at night, you're more likely to burn the next day because the circadian clocks in your skin, they're mostly controlled by light, but food input also matters. So if you're eating super late at night, you're sending the signal to your body that it's daytime. And now those clock mechanisms can get messed up, which means that your skin is not necessarily prepared to receive light at the right times of day. And so the morning light, sunrise into UVA rise, is like a really, really critical time of day for the circadian rhythm. And for turning on the pituitary gland, that sunrise light is really good at helping to turn on pregnenolone production into the pituitary, which is this precursor to all the major sex hormones. But then into that UVA rise, we're also getting stimulation of neuropsin, which is a UVA light detector on the eyes and on the skin, that helps to anchor in the circadian rhythm in those tissues. And we're also getting blue light in, starting at, not too long after sunrise. We're getting some blue light coming through, which is the primary light wavelength that the master clock in the brain is looking for in order to understand what time of day it is. And so getting that circadian anchored in the morning is a really good way to help buffer against sunburn through the circadian mechanism. And then we also have the added benefit of course, the infrared light, which will also begin intensifying throughout the day. And you're going to receive a ton of infrared light while you're getting UV light midday as well. So what I usually tell people to avoid burning is, Jack likes to call it a solar callus. Like, you gradually increase your sun exposure over time. Don't go 0 to 100. Don't go and like blast yourself for an hour if you haven't been in the sun in a year and like your skin is super pale, because you're going to burn and you're not going to be able to actually harness that photonic energy effectively. So gradually increasing, maybe 5-10 minutes, and then add a few minutes each day. Get your tolerance build up, because that melanin, as you start to get a tan, the melanin is a sign that you're actually building up the so-called solar callus and you're actually using that light effectively. Because we know when we make melanin that we're making POMC, because POMC is what's stimulating melanin production in the melanocytes. So that means we're getting all the benefits of, UV light if we're doing that. And so it's a really good readout. If you're getting a nice tan and you're not burning, it's a good sign.
Okay, so what do you think are the optimum strategies for optimizing circadian rhythm? And what practices do you integrate personally? Such as, are you regularly going out at sunrise and sunset? And what other, and how do you optimize the timing of your meals and sleep? I think those would probably be the top 3 contributions.
Yep. Yep. So sunrise into UVA rise is critical, like I mentioned before, from the blue light perspective, the UVA light perspective, and the red light perspective. Just getting that light into your eyes in the morning, especially from the sun, is super important because you're going from sleeping and darkness. Now your body needs to know it's time to wake up. It's time to turn on the processes associated with daytime, which include movement, cognition, digestion. These are all daytime processes that need to be regulated in a circadian manner. So if you're having issues with like gut health, for example, or brain fog or things like this, cognitive decline, super important to optimize this light exposure in the morning. And then the other side of that coin is that during the day, we need to get enough bright light, bright full spectrum light in particular, in order to keep that circadian rhythm functioning well and stimulating the body to say, hey, it's daytime. We need to engage in daytime activities throughout the entire day. And most indoor environments don't reach over 1,000 lux. Compare that to a bright sunny day outside, we can get up to 100,000 lux. And so we really need, if we're going to be inside, to put bright full spectrum lights in the environment. I like to use the Chroma Sky Portal. I'm using it right now. It's a 10,000 lux light that's full spectrum and opsin stimulating. So it has key frequencies in it in the violet and blue range to help tell your body, these frequencies are meant for daytime. If you have a lot of windows in your house, it's good, but it's technically not full spectrum because that window glass is filtering out UV and near infrared. And so if you can crack the windows, that's ideal to let some of that natural light actually through. Or if you're like me and like spring through fall, I mostly take my laptop and work outside all day, and I just have an umbrella where I'm working in the shade so the laptop doesn't overheat, but I'm receiving all of that light. Even in the shade, you're getting a ton more light and brightness than you would ever get inside. And so from a circadian standpoint, that's huge.
So what do you perceive as the MED, the minimum effective dose of bright sunlight exposure? Is it an hour and a half, 2 hours a day?
So for bright light, I think you kind of need it all day long. And so that doesn't necessarily mean you have to sit in the sun all day long or in the shade outside all day long, but it does mean that in your working environment indoors, you should try to optimize it to get at least 10,000 lux of light in your direct environment.
But I agree with you completely that you do need this super high intense exposure. And I think regularly, ideally every day. Now that's going to happen because there are cloudy days in certain areas of the country. There may be cloudy weeks or even months. So you're not going to get that bright sun, but you'll still be outside. And even in a cloudy day outside, most of the time, unless it's still brighter than inside. Way brighter,
yes.
So, but I think there's value to being in intense bright sunlight. And I'm wondering from that perspective, because assuming people have enough common sense to have a bright environment inside their house, most of us, it's physically impossible. We have to live, and we have an environment where we have to be inside. And that is one of the biggest challenges. It's very unusual for someone to spend more than 10% of their waking hours outside.
Yep.
It really is. It's very unusual.
That's the data.
Because you're sleeping. That's 6 to 8 hours. Boom, that's gone. You're definitely inside. So then you've got 2/3 of the time left. So it's really hard. So what do you think is the minimum effective dose?
Yeah, so I would say whenever you're outside for your sun exposure, for your UV and infrared exposure, that's going to be, you're getting that light as well into your eyes. Important to note that to harness the maximum benefits of UV light, you really need your eyes and your body, your skin exposed. UVA light is also a major stimulator of nitric oxide production, which is critical for cardiovascular health. And the more skin you have exposed, the more you make as well, which is kind of an aside. But I want to mention that because a lot of people wear UV blocking contacts, glasses, sunglasses outside.
Almost all sunglasses are UVA blocking. You can get some, but you'd have to be almost by prescription to get them.
Exactly. So with regards to contacts, Daly's Total One is one brand that doesn't have added UV blocking, and they're also permeable to UV light. So not fully, but you're probably going to get 50 to 70% of it through. And glasses-wise, CR39 lenses, which are an older type of plastic lens, are actually 55 to 60% UV permeable, as long as no added UV blocking is applied, like with a coating. And so those lenses can be requested from an eye doctor. They're actually cheaper than the standard polycarbonate lenses as well. But what I always tell people is when you're going outside for intentional sun exposure, just like pop the glasses off or like opt for glasses instead of contacts for that time of day so that you can easily take them off. And obviously, don't stare directly at the sun, but just let the ambient light into your eyes. That is plenty in order to get the stimulus to the brain to say, hey, we need to make Palm C. That's being made in the skin as well in response to UV light. That's going to help you make melanin. It's going to help you, reduce appetite, improve mood, energy expenditure, all these things, metabolic health. And yeah, so the eye exposure is really, really critical. And I like to talk about it because most people, given the rates of myopia, it's like 40% of adults or people in the country are myopic, meaning that most people are walking around with UV blocking on their eyes and they're missing this really essential input into, neurochemical production, basically. And that's also really important from the bright light perspective. Is really important to make serotonin and help to create the neurochemicals you need to actually feel good and be cognitively sharp throughout the day. If you're operating in dim light levels throughout the day in your office space, especially if you're under LED and fluorescent lights, we know that simply sitting under LED or fluorescent lights can increase your blood glucose and insulin completely independent of a single bite of food you put in your mouth. So that intense blue light in the absence of red and infrared light, because these bulbs do not have red or infrared light because they're quote unquote energy efficient. The high blue light concentrated part of their light spectrum means that ACTH can be produced actually from Palm C as well, but when Palm C is made in one part of the pituitary gland from blue light, it doesn't get fully cleaved. It ends at ACTH, which then stimulates cortisol production in the adrenal glands and then elevates cortisol, which is good in the morning. We want that morning cortisol response from our morning sun exposure. That's important. But if we're sitting under that intense blue light all day without red and infrared light, without UV light, now we're creating this imbalance and like an overly stressed response that's now having diminishing returns, let's say.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Very comprehensive. I appreciate your insights and sharing that. Do you have any other recommendations that you'd like to add to that as your highlights for optimizing biology based on your current focus?
Yeah. So the other important piece that we didn't talk about yet for circadian biology is, in addition to getting bright light during the day and sunlight in the morning and midday if you can, blocking blue light at night is absolutely critical because, again, blue light is the stimulus the brain and the eyes are looking for to determine what time of day it is. And so we're not meant to receive blue light in the evening. And yet most people, when it gets dark out, what do? They flip their light switches on, they have their TVs on, their phones on, they're blasting themselves with blue light, sending the signal to their bodies that it's still daytime. And so they never get into that nighttime mode. And in circadian biology, the nighttime is the time of day where we're recovering, we're regenerating, we're turning over tissues, we're taking out the trash through autophagy and mitophagy. And so if we're never getting that dark exposure at night, then we're not getting that half of the wheel of the circadian rhythm, which is a 24-hour cycle that's supposed to be split half day, half night, or half light, half dark, for example.
Yeah, so, it's sort of the curse of electricity. One of the curses, obviously, EMF is one, but also the ability to illuminate our internal environment or our environment in times when we were not supposed to have it. And then, of course, then candlelight kind of forced people to get to bed early.
Exactly.
I have a personal question for you. I have adopted a pattern of going to bed by 6 p.m. I'm typically asleep by 6:15. So most of the year, the sun is still shining when I'm going to bed. So I don't violate that before I go to sleep. But after I get up, I mean, it's on. Sometimes I get up yesterday. I get up at 11:30, and so there's 6 or 7 hours before the sun rises, and I'm just curious as to your thoughts on what I've adopted, and that is clearly there's no bright blue lights. There are cool whites, and it's just enough to get through and navigate the house until I can find my way to my office and do some work. And that is, 1800 Kelvin light and very dim and almost no light most of the time. So I'm wondering if you perceive any adverse complications from adopting that strategy.
That's actually really interesting. So how long have you been doing that?
About a year and a half.
Okay. How do you feel relative to before you were doing it?
Well, I'm doing a lot of different things, but my creativity has gone through the roof. I've written some books. And actually, I wanted to ask you a question when we got on. Did you finish your book? We were going to have this interview last week, and you were finishing your book. Did you finish it?
Yeah, well, the proposal, the book itself
Oh,
is not
okay.
written yet, but yeah.
Is this your first book?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, well, congratulations.
Thank you.
I've written 18 books,
Wow.
but and not to brag, I was just in response to your question, how I feel. Well, I'm now able to write almost a book a month.
Wow.
It took me like a year or 2 years to write a paper. Now I can write a paper, several papers a month.
Mhm.
So my productivity has gone through the roof. I mean, it's just now part of it is integrating some of these and productivity tools, right? But still, the creativity and the productivity are I'm doing more now than I've ever did in my entire life, almost combined.
Wow.
So
Well,
yeah,
what I can say there is I can actually kind of relate to that a little bit because I find that I do my best writing. It's not circadian aligned, but like I feel the most creative around like midnight to 2 a.m. or something like
yes,
this.
I call that the sacred time. And you know
Yeah.
what my reason for that is? Because that is a time of the day, just pragmatically, that there's very minimal distractions.
Yes.
And your mind isn't activated and going off all these different, and looking at an email, people calling. No, you're just focused on what you want to do.
Yeah.
That's the primary reason why I did it. Because, from 12 o'clock to 4 in the morning, which is, I have a commitment of 4 to 6 every day, but from 12 to 4, I can crank with like no, it's just like continuously, and time disappears.
Yeah.
You start and just like before you know it's 4 o'clock. Oh my gosh, it's
Yes.
crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there is something to like, there's special times of day where there's like more stillness and you can get more parasympathetic and get more like right
Yeah.
to left brain communication. So I think there may be something to that. And as long as like you're not getting any like super bright, super blue light, I think you can totally get away with that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
seem to, but you've studied this area more than me, and I'm fascinated with it just as equally as you are. But I haven't had the opportunity to, or maybe even the interest to explore it as deeply as you have. That's why I was curious as to your thoughts on it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think when it comes to health in general, like sometimes we have certain goals that we want to meet that require us to make sacrifices in one area to get benefits in another area. And I think it's up to us to decide what makes sense in our given context. And that doesn't mean it's got to stay that way forever, but there's different seasons in life for different behaviors and different choices. So I think it's totally reasonable to say, even though I should be, going to bed after sunset and waking up around when the sun wakes up, that I feel like I want to be up, in the night so that I can write because I feel better writing at that time. Like,
Well,
it's reasonable.
and some people do choose to be awake during those hours, but I think they're doing it incorrectly. And I would
Yes.
really be curious as to your feedback with respect to circadian rhythm violation, because they're staying up. In other words, they're waking up maybe 8, 9, 10, maybe even later, and they're staying up till 2, 3, or 4, and then going to bed. And I think that's the wrong strategy. It violates some fundamental tenets of circadian biology.
Yeah, so what I would say is that from a circadian perspective, it's not only important that you sleep when it's dark, it's also important to just get a period of the day that there's not blue light present. And so I think there's benefits, like even if you were to stay up all night, as long as it's dim and no blue light present, I think you still receive benefits from that from a circadian perspective, even if you're not sleeping.
Okay, that's interesting. I
Yeah.
would definitely appreciate your feedback on it, because there's this adage, and I don't know how true it is, and again, curious as to your thoughts on it, that for every hour of sleep before midnight is worth 2 hours of sleep.
Yeah, I've heard that.
So I don't know if there's any truth to that. I mean, this could be an old wives' tale. I don't know.
Yeah, I have heard that, and in like traditional Chinese medicine, there's different hours, and I think the liver hour is somewhere around midnight or like 11 to 1 or something like this. And it's like if you don't get to sleep by this time, then you're missing out on that window of time where that organ is going to regenerate. And obviously, we don't know that through the Western lens, but that's the Eastern lens at least believes that that's the case. So it's certainly possible that that's the case. What I can personally say for myself is if I go to bed after like 2:30 a.m., I feel pretty low energy the next day. If I'm like staying up, all through the night and then going to bed at like 2:33 a.m., which actually happened like 2 weekends ago because we went to a Celtics game in New York and then we didn't end up getting back until like after 2. And like I went to bed and I slept 8, 9 hours, but I wasn't well rested. So I think you can get a sense of like, depending on where you're sleeping, as long as you're honest with yourself and like maybe journaling about how you're feeling in these different patterns and finding out what works for you. But I mean, I think the safest bet for people who have control over their schedules, if you go to bed with the sun and wake up with the sun, it's probably what our ancestors would do naturally because there's no light available, so you can't really do that much when it's dark
Well,
out.
our ancestors in northern or temperate climates, the latitude most of us live in, didn't do that because that would be in the summer, very small time, but it would doable. It'd be 6 hours of sleep. But in the winter, it's 18 hours of sleep, and no one's sleeping for 18 hours. There has to be.
True. So I mean, I guess it is more of like other mammals will do much more hibernating in the winter, so it's definitely a time for more rest and less activity in general. But yeah, I think it doesn't mean you have to sleep 18 hours. It mostly would just mean that, you're kind of taking it easy. You're not going all out, guns blazing.
For sure. Well, this has been absolutely delightful. I was so looking forward to this, and I wasn't disappointed. So you're an amazing wealth of knowledge, and thank you for the time to share it. And I know you have some resources. I don't recall what they are. I think you have a website and you have a consulting service that you have. So would you like to mention those now?
Yeah, sure. So I'm mostly active on Instagram at Dr. Alexis Jasmine, Jazmyn. I'm also posting on X pretty frequently as well. So I post a ton of free content on there, just educating people about the science around the things that I've been talking about today, and a bunch of references.
What's your handle on X?
Also, Dr. Alexis Jasmine.
Okay.
Same as on Instagram, and posting a lot of references and science for people to see. Like if there's certain people who like it resonates with them and they don't need the buy-in. There's certain people that want the left brain verification, like, oh, this is published in Nature and Cell or whatever. So all of that is available. I've also written an ebook, which basically outlines all the basics around light water magnetism, optimizing mitochondrial health. That I've even had like middle schoolers do book reports on, which is pretty cool. So it's like fun for the whole family. It's digestible. It's like written for the lay person. So that's available. I also teach coursework through my business. So I just recently am finishing up a course called Boot Camp Reboot, which basically was actionable protocols in circadian and light biology in all different areas, from like exercise to nutrition, circadian eating, to optimizing your light exposure habits, optimizing mitochondrial health. What else do we get into? Cognitive function, physical performance, things like this. I also have a course on scientific literacy that's like pre-recorded, so kind of just like self-paced or whatever. But
where is that available at?
Also, in my link in bio on Instagram, people can find, and on Twitter or X, people can find links to all of these different things. But in that course, I teach people how to read papers, basics around statistics and how statistics are used in science to report data, sometimes disingenuously, let's say. We also talk about logical fallacies and how to critically think well. And I also have a monthly membership program right now called The Incubator, which is a book club and think tank. So right now we're reading The Body Electric by Becker. And we're also doing watch parties for different audiovisual content, including different podcasts. So we basically we'll watch some important podcasts together, and I'll like pause and narrate as they go to help teach them about the science that's being talked about. And that's been really fun. We have I think a bit over 200 people in there, a very lively Telegram group, and it's been really, really enjoyable. And so those are some of the ways that people can work with me. On the one-on-one side, I do offer some brain rentals, so people can rent my brain for 30 minutes or an hour if they have specific questions for their, implementing these things in their life, or if they're, have any issues, whether they want to learn the science better or improve their health. They can book an hour or 30 minutes with me.
That's on X or Instagram?
Yep. Also, link in bio for that. And yeah, I would say those are the main ways people can find me. I'm in the process of working on a book, so hopefully in the next year and a half, people will be able to access that as well.
Yeah, and if they want to find the podcast that you do have, do not make the mistake I did and type in your name on YouTube. You will not find it. It has another name. So what is your podcast channel name? Because I would suggest typing your name in there, because I think you're missing a lot of people. At least put it. Obviously it's not for ego at all. It's just to allow people to find you.
That's simple. A good point. Yeah. So my podcast is called Undoctrinate Yourself. And that's basically a play on the word indoctrinate instead of indoctrinating. I want people to unlearn to relearn, basically, and then to critically think well. And that's been a really fun. We're on episode 42 now. I started in October of 2023, and it's been absolutely a joy. I absolutely love doing the podcast. And so people can find that on YouTube. on Spotify. I just recently started posting the episodes on X, and they'll all be available on all platforms within the next couple weeks. I have somebody helping me do that.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do some great work there. And the name of and topic of your book. And did you finish the draft or was that a proposal?
Just the proposal.
Okay.
So I actually don't have a name yet. The whole proposal, I'm not 100% done with it, but basically just did the chapter outlines and the overall overview.
That's the first step.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really hard to write a book. Actually, I wrote 2 papers just in the last month, and I wrote the first paper. No, maybe it was the second, without an outline. And that was a disaster. Because you have this beautiful work, but it has to be pasted together. If it's not, it doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
You write the outline first if you're going to write.
Exactly.
So what is the theme of your book?
So it's about light. Which includes non-native EMFs and also the UV through infrared. So it's going to be full spectrum. We're also going to be talking about mitochondria within that book as well and how that weaves into the story. Doesn't have a name yet, but stay tuned for that.
Oh, good. I'm really looking forward to it because you've got a massive amount of information that you've been able to weave together in a way that makes a lot of sense and helps people put it to understand it. So thank you for all your work. It's been great.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really fun. I love talking about this stuff, especially with people who really get it like yourself. So it's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for watching. Remember, hit the like and subscribe button so you can get more videos that can help you and your family take control of your health.